Hi, my name is Park, and I'm your Uber driver today. People always ask me, you can drive anytime you want. So, how do you decide when to actually drive? Well, I happen to moonlight as a PhD researcher, so I know that there's a whole bunch of factors that can bring gig workers out to work. But first, let's take a closer look at what the gig economy is. So, here I'm talking about a market system in which workers provide their labor for short term services. And it's been around for quite some time. You may have seen it in freelancing or in the retail industry. And more recently, all these on demand apps or services that connect us in real time with someone who can help us with things like driving us to places or delivering our food. You can see that these services are pretty convenient and appealing to consumers like us. And at the same time, they're pretty attractive to workers. In fact, more and more people are joining this flexible workforce. And by now, at least 60 million people in the US have already participated. It is growing so fast that soon more people will be in gig employment rather than conventional full-time jobs. And especially in the time, in the world we're living in right now, even more and more jobs are going to be independent. So what brings workers into this flexible workforce? Well, as I suggested, most of the time people will say flexibility and autonomy are the key perks drawing these people in. So it means that workers can fully decide their work schedules, when they want to work, how long they want to work, and which platform they want to work for. This flexibility can be good for companies as well. You can see companies now have a larger pool of workers they can recruit from. They can hire workers with different skill levels to at different times. But it's also not completely simple. As you can see, the core of the success of the gig company relies on the real-time matching between demand and supply. So knowing less about your supply side can be a problem here. So when our supply side is very independent, it is getting harder and harder to know how many workers are going to show up to work. So this poses a huge challenge for companies in planning and also committing to the service capacity. And also not just during busy time when you need more people, there's also times when you only need a handful of workers. How can you actually recruit the right number of workers to show up at the right time? So in this paper, we study how gig workers make decisions about their flexible schedules. And also we look at how companies can take these insights to inform better incentives to recruit and manage their flexible workers. We are also going to show how better understanding the way workers make decisions can help policymakers develop more effective regulations. So companies have been using various strategies to try to bring in more workers, from real-time flash pricing, where the pay is higher during busy hours, to pre-announcing bonuses ahead of time, so that some workers who might enjoy planning in advance will choose to work for the company. We also have companies that are trying to use some sort of psychological tricks to not only bring in more workers, but also nudge them to work longer for them. So how good are these strategies and how can we recommend a better one? We first have to understand how workers react to incentives. And luckily, economists have been studying this for a long time. So they propose two contrasting theories. On one side, we have neoclassical or standard income theory, where people are rational, trying to maximize their lifetime utility. So if you increase an hourly wage, people should work more. And there's actually a lot of papers that look at workers who can adjust their work hours to some degree. And they found that positive wage shocks are positively related to the number of people who worked. But in other settings like taxi drivers, people found something different. For example, a seminal work by Cameron et al. Shows that on days with higher earning rates per hour, taxi drivers in New York actually worked less. So it appears that their daily decisions are influenced by their income targets. So it means drivers may have a goal of how much money they want to make for the day. So if today is paying really well, they don't have to work that long to reach their income target. So many follow-up work has further looked into this behavioral explanation of labor supply. And a couple actually found that maybe people target for how long they want to work or have a time target rather than having an income target. So here, one of the goals of our paper is to reconcile the theories, and we try to figure out which one better explains the behaviors of gig workers. In operations management, there's also a fast growing interest in this topic, but for the interest of time, I won't go into details about this great work. Our paper focuses mainly on the supply side, particularly what drives decisions of the workers. So here we interested in traditional factor like hourly wage, and also behavioral factors like income and time targets I mentioned earlier. So we focus on the direction at which these variables affect two types of work decisions, working or not, and if so, how long. So since we try to take the behavioral component aside, we expect to see positive wage elasticity here, as explained by the standard income theory. On the behavioral side, we expect to see income targeting behavior. So now in most cases, we don't really observe the exact income target that each worker has. So we will use a proxy that has been used in past work, which is income so far, or ISF. This is the amount of income the worker has already earned before she makes a new work decision. So the idea here is the higher income so far, the more likely or the closer she probably is to her income goal. So similarly, we expect to see time targeting behavior among workers. And again, we don't observe the exact time target that workers has. So we're gonna use a proxy hour so far, or SSF, which is the amount of time the workers has recently worked before making a new decision. So to test these hypotheses, we collaborate with a ride-hailing company in the US and analyze their drivers' data in New York City. This company operates slightly differently than some of the names that may pop up in your mind right now. One being that the drivers actually earn at a guaranteed financial incentive rate. This includes base rate and promotions, in which we're gonna lump them all together as offer. These offers depend on the time of day, vary across drivers, and are usually communicated to the drivers ahead of time. On the consumer side, most riders are regular commuters, so they pay a flat rate to use a service, which means there's no surge pricing here, and drivers do not compete internally to try to get a better rate. The company defines 6 operating shifts for each day, and the offer is decided at the shift level. So what we observe is the shift level financial offer information for every driver, and also whether or not they worked, and if they did, how long they worked. So one great thing here is that we also observe the offer information for those who did not work. So this really helps us better understand why some workers may choose not to work on some days. We have a year worth of data, and we observe a variety of vehicle types in which we will control for our analysis. So if you think about ride-hailing industry, you probably know that it's quite competitive. And from our own experience, you may have seen drivers who put up multiple devices to try to hop on and off between different apps. Luckily for us, based on our interview with the drivers, and also from this data set, this hopping on and off behavior doesn't seem to be very common in our data set. But to be sure, we still want to make sure that we do our best trying to control for potential competition or market conditions. So since we don't really observe the information on the competing platforms, we are going to use the public data released by the Taxi and Limousine Commission, or TLC, in New York, that contains every single trip done by taxi drivers and also ride-hailing drivers. So here we can come up with a number of metrics that help us control for competition, like the volume from competition, traffic or congestion information, and also potential surge pricing on competing platforms. So next we want to talk about how we can use these data sets to help us answer our research questions. So the first question is about the probability of working. So we want to see in the raw data what happens if we increase hourly wage. So you can see here that when you increase hourly wage, drivers are more likely to work, but not all the time. At this higher rate, these incentives seem to be less effective. It can also mean that the company is trying to provide a really interesting, appealing rate to attract drivers who haven't been very active recently. So this tells us that our key variable hourly offer or hourly wage may run into endogeneity problem. So to address this issue, we're gonna use an instrumental variable approach. So we went in to talk to the company and try to understand how they decide on these offers. The key things we learned are that the main factor that affect the offer is how active each driver has been recently. And also the company decides on these offers separately for different vehicle types. So SUV versus sedans are handled differently. So this gives us an idea that we can use a new IV called offers of coworkers, in which coworkers here are drivers who are also currently available to work now. They made similar decisions in the past with the full co-driver, but they drive a different vehicle type. So for example, for a sedan driver, we're gonna look at non-sedan drivers who also show up to work today. And we're gonna look back in the past and try to identify which among them make similar decisions to the full co-driver. So we're gonna call this group as my co-workers. So the idea here is that because these two groups, the co-workers and the full co-driver, they made similar work decisions in the past, the companies is going to adjust the incentives in the same direction. But because the incentives are decided separately for different vehicle types, and in general, drivers don't really observe the offers of other drivers, the co-workers' offers should not directly affect my decision to drive. The second thing we're interested in is the work duration. So here, of course, we can look at people who worked and look at the number of hours they work and how much wage we provide. But as I mentioned earlier, our data set also provides something extra. We have also information for people who did not work as well. We know what kind of offer were sent to them. So having this extra piece of information allow us to address another type of bias we may have, which is sample selection. As you can see, the decision to work is not completely random. Here we modifying our well-known Heckman two-stage method to correct for this selection bias when we analyze the work duration. So putting all this together, we have the first stage of estimation being a control function probit, where we try to relate the probability of working with the instrumented offer, a set of control variables which proxy for demand, market conditions, short and long-term habits of the drivers. And then we include our key variables here, income so far, which is a proxy for income target, and then hours so far, which is the proxy for the time target. Then we can condition on people who did work, and we can use two-state least squares with fixed effects to try to relate the number of hours they work with instrumented earnings, the two target proxies, a different set of control variables, and then inverse Mills ratio, which is computed from the first stage to correct for selection bias. And here's a formal representation of our model estimation strategy, but let's move on to the results. So here, we're gonna show you how the key variables influence driver decisions at the beginning of each shift throughout the day. So here the targets of progress towards income so far or hours so far get reset every midnight. So a new day, it's like a new count. Here we're gonna focus on the sign and significance of the estimates. So if you don't see any colors, it means that it's not significant at p-value 0.05. So first, we found that financial incentives have a generally positive impact to the work decision. So it means that we have support for our first hypothesis that the higher the hourly wage, the more supply we will get. Next, we look at income so far, and we found that the more you earned early on in the day, the less likely you will work on a new shift. So this kind of resembles the income targeting behavior in the sense that the more you earn, the more likely you will reach your target, and the less likely you would work. So our second hypothesis is also supported here. And lastly, we look at the hours so far. Here we found that the longer you've been working actively, before, the more likely you work on a new shift. So we don't really find evidence that people have time tracking behavior, but rather we saw that workers appear to keep the momentum of work going if they're already on the road, or they have some sort of inertia not to change their work decisions. So we have an ongoing work that trying to investigate this issue. But for now, inertia appears to be consistent behavior, and it seems to be a pretty good outcome for the company. Then we take a look at the duration of work for each shift, and we found that the three effects are consistent in this stage as well. We also find an evidence that there is a significant sample selection into working in our setting. We also consider models where drivers don't make decisions this frequently. So for example, you can think of drivers who may just decide at the beginning of the day how many hours they want to work. In this case, you can also think of the case where people have weekly goals instead of daily goals, like how much money they want to earn for the week. So in this particular extension, the key insights are consistent, especially the inertial behavior. We also found that drivers do not seem to make the duration decision for the entire day ahead of time. So this actually highlights some interesting things about gig workers. Like, unlike traditional employees where they may plan about their work weeks or months in advance, gig workers appear to actually make decisions much more frequently, at least at the shift level, as we see earlier. So putting all this together, we find evidence for both theories of labor supply and also a new phenomenon, inertia, which seems to be a good outcome for companies as it consistently encourages workers to work. These insights are robust to different specifications and different robustness tests we ran, from doing survival models to including nonlinearity, or when we try to proxy for potential search pricing on other platforms. In all these tests, the main insights remain qualitatively consistent. So what can we do with these insights? So here we want to propose a way that the company can actually optimize their target incentive allocation. So the main idea is that for every driver, we're going to predict how likely they're going to work if they only receive the base wage without any promotions. And then using their past work frequency as a threshold, we can then compute what is the amount of extra incentive we have to give to them so that their predicted work probability is closer to the past work frequency. We can do this for every driver, and then we can rank all of them based on this extra amount of incentive we need to give to them. So in our out of sample counterfactual, we look at two objectives here. One in which the company has a fixed budget to give promotions. We show that our approach can recruit 22% more drivers without incurring additional cost. On the other hand, if the company has a fixed goal of how many workers they need to show up, then we show that our approach actually can achieve that at 30% less cost on average. So you can see some examples of how the companies can utilize our insights, but what about the workers? As I said earlier, they are the heart of the gig economy. If you've seen some news recently or in recent years, you may see that gig workers, some of them are struggling financially. So in response to that, in New York City, they adopted new rules at the end of 2018, such that the platforms have to pay drivers a minimum wage or a minimum amount for each trip. So here we want to actually figure out whether having this new policy can actually make workers better off. So what we're going to compare is the three policies, the optimal policies that we proposed, the minimum wage policy that the city imposed, and the firm current policy. And the outcome we're going to compare across these policies will be how much an average driver would earn per hour if they show up to work. So we show that it's great. Minimum wage policies actually help workers earn more money compared to the current practice. But when we actually compare to the optimal policy, it turns out that with the minimum wage policies, drivers actually earn about 10 to 23% less than optimal. So this is quite interesting because if you think about TLC that adopted these rules, they have a lot of information about all the trips that happen, but they may not have information about how incentives were allocated or how workers make work decisions. So this shows that really understanding how workers make decisions can really help you figure out what might be a better regulation. In this case, while minimum wage policy seems to be good, the drivers will actually earn slightly less than what they could have earned optimally. So today, I've shown you how we study the decision-making of gig workers. And one of the key insights is the existence of this inertia behavior among workers. So we're not claiming that every gig worker will exhibit such a behavior, but there's a lesson to be learned here about particular incentive policies that companies can use. You can see in these days, companies are fighting really hard, trying to win over the mutual pool of workers. So here we show that by understanding how workers make decisions can be really powerful in improving your own operations, in promoting platform loyalty among your workers, and even help you design better incentives and regulations that ensure good welfare for the workers as well. So I think this is your destination. So I hope you enjoy this virtual trip and have a good day. Thank you.